In March of 1968, a tired and frustrated President Johnson went on television to announce that he had ordered a halt to air and naval bombardments of North Vietnam. And in closing, he shocked the nation, declaring,
I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
But Johnson's announcement did little to quell opposition to the war. At the forefront of the protests was what observers called the New Left. In the beginning, it was made up mostly of middle-class college students who were inspired by the civil rights movement to become politically active.
There is now a cohort of people ready to say the United States can do wrong things. And not only that, but we know how to protest. We're not afraid to get out in the street. We're not afraid to march. We're not afraid to take on authority. We're not afraid to say the government is wrong.
In April 1965, one of the New Left's leading groups, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, organized the first anti-Vietnam War March on Washington, which drew tens of thousands of protesters. Some protesters broke the law by burning their draft cards. Others set fire to the American flag in protest. Perhaps the most dramatic anti-war demonstrations occurred in the summer of 1968 during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. While delegates inside the convention hall went about the business of nominating their presidential candidate, Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey, protesters outside battled police. For 2 days, police and National Guard troops, using clubs, rifle butts, and tear gas, squared off against protesters throwing rocks and bottles. Resistance to the war took many forms other than mass protests. Some young men who were drafted to serve in Vietnam refused to go, claiming a special exemption granted to conscientious objectors. Many other young men tried to avoid the draft by claiming physical disabilities. Others simply left the country. Three months after the Chicago riots, Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election. During his campaign, Nixon announced he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Known as vietnamization, the plan called for the South Vietnamese Army to take over full responsibility for fighting the ground war and a gradual withdrawal of all American troops from Vietnam. Although President Nixon made good on his promise to begin bringing American troops home, he was still determined not to lose the war. His plan included increased military aid for the South, so even while troop numbers were cut, the air war raged on. Nixon also secretly expanded the war to include Vietnam's neighbors, Cambodia and Laos. President Johnson had declared these countries off-limits to U.S. attacks. That had allowed them to become a safe haven for the North Vietnamese. So President Nixon authorized a secret bombing campaign against North Vietnamese bases in Cambodia. In April 1970, President Nixon ordered U.S. ground troops to invade Cambodia. The escalation of the war sparked massive protests on college campuses all around the country. One of those campuses was Kent State University in Ohio. When a student demonstration protesting the Cambodian invasion spilled over into disturbances in downtown Kent, Ohio's governor called out the National Guard. 2 days later, the Guard, which was poorly trained in dealing with riots, used tear gas to disperse a crowd of protesters on campus. But after some rock throwing and heckling, some guardsmen fired their rifles, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others.
After the firing stopped, there was just this sudden stillness. And that must have lasted 10 to 15 seconds. It was just the contrast from the yelling and then the firing and then all of a sudden this stillness. And then people began to scream, "Get help, get help, get help."
The tragedy at Kent State along with additional killings at Jackson State in Mississippi, were the culmination of public protests against the war, the most divisive war in U.S. history.